What we're going to talk about regarding electrical distribution and terminology is a process that can, true to the ACG guideline process, can be applied to other things, not just electrical distribution equipment. And we'll try to stay on topic, but it's really easy to take the proposed means and methods and apply it to non-electrical content. And you may already. And again, there's going to be time at the end where this isn't all-inclusive. This is just some things that myself, the guideline, think that would help providers, and as important, help owners who want to know more about what they're asking for, or even what to ask for. We're seeing scope. It just says electrical distribution, and you go ask the owner what that means. They don't know, and they're looking to you, and they'll say, "Well, you tell me what that means," and they're like, "Well, how much money do you have? I'll tell you what it means." So it's and that, I say that tongue in cheek, but that could be the recourse or some refrain for some agreed upon scope of work. You're not necessarily, if you want to commission the world and you believe in what we're doing, it's you want to commission everything, right? But that may not be in the budget. And then if you provide a price for commissioning everything, and then somebody else understands the client goals, or is essentially comparing apples to apples with the client, you're not going to win that work when maybe you're the more qualified provider. So again, I'm not here to tell you how to do it, and we'll get into that here the second half of this presentation, the actual means and method. But these are some processes that I think will help define electrical distribution equipment. These next few slides, I think if you've been here today, you've seen these a couple times. A bunch of architects make me put these on the slides, so here they are. I'm not going to read from the slides per se. I think if George is still in the room, I believe all these slides are made available to everybody. I looked on the app. I could see the slides, so if you want this content, the NFPA references and such are going to be provided later. It's available to you. You can't find it, I'll be here all day and all day tomorrow. We'll talk about it in more detail. Some more of these AIA slides. Okay, we're going to get to the meat and potatoes of it. Again, the first part of this presentation is going to be providing context, a little bit of history. Why are we even talking about this? I know what a panel board is, but it's not that you know what a panel board is. It's that you and the client can agree what a panel board is. And we're going to talk about, when the best time to have that discussion is. And I would make the argument, and I'm certainly going to do it here in this presentation, the how and the when are very closely related. So if you're sitting here today, you read the course description and the lesson learned that are on the slide, and I'm not going to read the slides to you. But if I had to redo this presentation, I would have put the too long didn't read portion of it up front, and for some reason it's buried like slide 20. Too long didn't read. If you want to define electrical equipment, some methods that are going to be outlined in the forthcoming ACG guideline include using industry standards. If you don't know what the owner wants, simply say, well, I'm defining a switchboard as NFPA defines it, and then say this is how I'm defining it. How do you want to define it? Have some context or basis for what you're saying, an argument, and make a case to bolster your argument to this is what we think you want. This is what we think that want is. NFPA does provide definitions that can be used in this context, and that context would be responding to an RFQ and RFP. And we're going to pull up some examples. I've got the good, the bad, the ugly, and kind of in that order. And unfortunately, it's probably going to be familiar to all of us, especially the bad. But a one project that adds value to the client isn't a bad. It just could lead to some frustration. And we'll talk about some of those, just some examples. A takeaway from Mark's presentation this morning is I didn't include enough pictures. But hopefully we can make up for it with some stories, mine and yours. I kind of just talked about one of the too long didn't read, using industry standards. you can use accepted terminology, right? And it's kind of a double-edged sword. When I say accepted terminology, it's accepted based on that project. If you open up the drawings, you take a look at the one line, and the owner says, I want you to commission, all my panel boards, or all my distribution panel boards and up. And you're like, okay, cool. I'm going to go look at the one line, and everywhere I see a DP or it says distribution panel board, I'm going to have the understanding that's what the owner wants. Is that a smart decision just to count that up and then, yeah, this is 100 hours to do all your DPs, and up. Is that smart? It may not be wrong, but is it better to say, here's 100 hours to commission distribution panels, and we interpret distribution panels similarly to the engineer of record? So what I'm getting at is, don't reinvent the wheel if you don't have to. Same way by using NFPA, you're not reinventing the wheel. You're just providing a basis for a future argument that you can win. So if somebody comes up to you later and says, I thought, this is what I had in mind and this is what I paid you to do, you can go back to your response to the RFQ or the RFP or, your contract and say, look, Mr. and Mrs. Owner, we thought we knew what you wanted, and here's clearly where we said, we interpret this to be this. And that is also a great opportunity to say, if you want us to include this, we'll do so. So it's really two things are being done when you're responding. This is the when and the how, and I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here. The when and the how is, early and often. You respond to work. You're chasing the work. Cover your butt in your response to chasing that work, because the people that are signing the contract aren't the people you're necessarily working for or seeing down the road. I've got a slide for this later, but what I mean by that is, we say the client, and the client is not necessarily the owner, and there's a distinction to be made here. The facility operator, whether they're the person signing your checks or not, approving your invoices, ultimately you're going to be on a project, and you're going to be walking around, and most commissioning providers, just speaking electrically, we try to involve facility operations. It's a value add. It's a value add, it's no skin off your back to invite somebody and just kind of walk through a test procedure. Mark did a great job going over integrated system testing. That's something that most facility operators aren't going to get an opportunity to see. So when we're taking a method that we can use to describe electrical power distribution equipment, we can also use that to describe other scope items, integrated system testing. Or an example, we were paid to, had a project where we were asked to commission an emergency power system, and to us, we clearly defined what emergency power was. We used NFPA, and when you say emergency power system, Mr. and Mrs. Client, we interpret that to be EPS, emergency power sources per NFPA, EPSS, distribution equipment. And then we go on to say essential equipment, that distribution equipment below the EPSS. Essentially, power goes out, how's it come back on? What's that look like? So we're relying on NFPA to define this, and we do it in the contract. And then in this instance, I thought I defined it. It was defined fairly clearly, but doing a test, at the 11th hour at the end of a project, you think you understand what's going on, and then somebody with facility operations who you've not seen before shows up with why aren't you doing that? I'm like, well, that's not what you asked us to do. That's a tough conversation. You don't want to say no, but you also don't want to give away your services for free. You want your time to be valued. You need to stay in. If you're good at what you do, you want to stay in business and keep providing value to other owners. So, how to address scope is very similar to how to address and define equipment. And those are I would make the argument the same, very similar, and can be done at the same time. So here we see a fairly, did I skip over a slide? Here we see a not too exciting, not too exciting scope. Looks familiar to everybody. What's driving this? An energy conservation standard lead. Before it was just lighting controls. Now it's lighting controls, and then every once in a while you see the bullet point distribution equipment. And this is where I'm going to digress from the topic a little bit more. LEED is driving this bullet point. So if you're a commissioning provider that's trying to satisfy LEED, and somebody says, hey, I want you to commission my building, and all they say is commission lighting controls, and it's a LEED project, I think the response should be, and I would argue it should be, here's what it'll take, here's the effort that it'll take to cost to do what you're asking. By the way, notice it's a LEED project. Somebody's going to have to commission these other things you're not asking for. We would like to do it. So you kind of jump into the end. It's going to be commissioned, and this is something that's often overlooked. It is required, but I think taking out of context and defining what distribution equipment is important here, but understanding what is driving it is also equally important. So I can tell you can go to NFPA and it'll tell you what a panel board is. May not help you for every project. The takeaway is the methods and means described in the forthcoming ACG guideline isn't all inclusive, and not one of them is a silver bullet, but taken as a whole will provide better outcomes, help reduce some of those more uncomfortable conversations you have with clients, and in my experience lead to more work. Because the people developing these contracts or signing the contracts, they're not often electrically minded. If anything, they may come from mechanical backgrounds, if you're lucky, and oftentimes they're not technically savvy. So they just know that it's LEED, and they see electrical distribution, and they don't know what that means, and they're going to look to you to define what that is. So industry standards are a good place to go. A short story about that. We've reached out to LEED to say, hey, what do you mean by this? This is vague, electrical distribution equipment. And as we expected, as SSR expected, the response was very equally vague and of no help. But you can Google that response, and it's made available to the public. In short, and this is my conspiracy theory, LEED's intentionally vague because they're in competition, right? They don't want to make something so specific that it drives up construction costs, and owners are like, I don't really want to do that. So that there's competing with other for-profit accreditation services. So they don't tell you exactly what it is, and they leave it up to you as the provider to provide a solution, is how I interpret that. So when you see electrical distribution, the project's LEED, how many people would include transformers? Show of hands. Like K13 transformers, or just all transformers? Just all? That's not wrong. I can't tell. Nobody's going to ever tell you that's wrong. I think you certainly can make a case for it. And I'm not telling you what's right or wrong about interpreting LEED. It's what I'm trying to get at is as us as providers, we have a common understanding, and what the guideline is trying to provide in the next and future iterations is this means and method, so that we as providers have a common base. So that as an owner can make decisions based on qualifications, and we as providers can provide a scope that is a value add. So when I interpret electrical distribution for LEED, it's out of context when it's just that bullet point. It's electrical distribution for the purposes of energy conservation. LEED entirely cares. That's all. When LEED goes to sleep and when LEED wakes up, it's dreaming about energy conservation. That's all it cares about. And when you put in that bullet point, electrical distribution, that's not necessarily electrical conservation or energy conservation. That's my interpretation, not that it's right or wrong. So if you dig into LEED a little bit more, they're more concerned with, in this context, metering, advanced metering, that type of credit. So when I see this scope, my response is, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Owner, I see you want to commission distribution equipment. I also see the project's LEED. I interpret your ask to be distribution equipment that is associated with energy conservation, that is being power monitored and metered. So if I go to the one line and I see a PMM, power monitor meter box on a panel board, I'm going to count that up as scope. And that's how I go about it. I don't know if it's right or wrong. Lee's not telling me it's right or wrong. And if anybody else has any clarification, speak up, at the end, please. But it's all to illustrate that it's the context of the ask that helps define equipment. And it's also project specific, understanding what the client wants. I mean, a client could say, I want you to, a client, you could show up on a project and just have a client that says, I call generators canoes. You had better commission all their canoes if you're commissioning emergency power system. It doesn't matter what you want to call it. It matters what the client agrees to. And that contract, that response is the perfect place to say, this is what we think it is, and cover your butt, essentially. Here's another scope item. It's kind of, or another RFQ or RFP. It's kind of vague, It's just as vague as the previous one. Just says distribution equipment. Where do you start and stop? Do you start at the secondary of the utility transformer sitting outside into the building? Do you go all the way down to branch panel boards when you see this? Are you subject to conductors that are being run above ceiling and in the walls? Are you subject to being there when UFO grounding is being installed outside, or like below grade cable pulls? Where do you draw the line, right? Like there's, it sounds silly, a lot of that. A lot of people are like, we'll never do that. You just haven't met a client yet that's going to expect it. But it's rare, but not rare. It's just it's not common. But like you get a contract and you say, I'm going to give you 100 hours to do that, and you don't define what that is, you could be in trouble. You have a relationship with that client. Maybe you should define what that is. And again, the ACG guidelines providing means and methods to do so. Here's we're starting to get into we started out the ugly, the bad, and going good. So we're kind of moving the other direction. Here's just a little bit better of a type of or like a request for a price for commissioning services. This is not necessarily specific to electrical distribution equipment, but it's a little bit more niche. When you see that in normal power and emergency power, I kind of talked about this a little bit. NFPA is a good place to go to for resources to define what that is. If you're, Mark talked about integrated system testing earlier this morning. If we're asked to commission an emergency power system, we would certainly want to incorporate some type of integrated system testing. And this is a good place to define, what the equipment and scope is. If you had a scope item that simply just said emergency power system, does that just mean the generators and the ATS and paralleling gear? Is you as a provider, are you doing a disservice if you say, I'm going to commission those things independently, but I'm not going to commission them together? You just seeing the generator load banks enough, seeing the ATS transfers enough, seeing the fuel system with the generator works enough. Is that enough? And I'd make the case no. Integrated system testing should be expected and is a great value add for our process. But you also want to make sure that you've accounted for that in your effort, right? You don't want to do it for free. It's great if you do. You just got to consider how long you're going to stay in business if you're good at what you do. We want good providers to keep in the mainstream and keep doing this thing we're calling the commissioning process. It helps us all. If you see a line item like that and you look at a one line and there's, let's just say it's normal power distribution and you see a UPS, are you going to include the UPS in your scope? I mean, you got to kind of, it's project specific, right? If the scope is just power distribution or it reads normal power, you look at that UPS, the answer to that is, it's different for every project. How is that UPS being used, its application? Is it being considered an emergency power, battery source or whatever NFPA is calling, non-generator emergency power sources these days? Does it fit in the context of this? If do you have an understanding of what the client wants? And then, I think you asked for this, but I really think you want to include this. So now you've decided to include UPSs. Does that mean you're going to go to every data closet and check every shoebox sized, rack mounted 5 kW UPS, say there's 100 of them? Sure. The answer is yeah, if you're getting paid for it, is the hook, If that's what they want, put it in the response and say, I think this is what you want. And if nothing else, it leads to a value add discussion, right? So it's not getting yourself out of work. It's, if anything, leading to value add to the project where you can lead, where that's based on a cost versus value discussion. It breaks my heart when I show up on a project and we got 100 hours to commission the lighting control system, and there's a brand new emergency power system and nobody's looking at it, and I just know that it's not getting treated fairly. And you show up on site, and if I could have had a conversation, or if the owner was more receptive, like, look, how about we sample the lighting controls a little bit less and just let me take a look at, and just let me just see the generators parallel and just do a load shed scheme. Like, I'll write you a test, just anything. But what's driving scope is often dictating where that effort is going. And one of the means and method that the ACG guideline is going to cover is how to have those conversations. It's not right or wrong. Clients have a budget. I'm sure some clients want you to commission everything, but they only have so much money. And then the conversation is, well, okay, what can we do for this? And that's not a bad conversation. That's better than go commission my lighting controls just because that's what I think lead wants. And that I would advocate steering away from accepting that and more towards being comfortable with value cost discussions. If it leads to a reduction in scope, that may happen. But as a whole, that's not been my experience. It's led to more services by saying, I'm just doing this, and if you want me to do this, I can. It's the defining of scope, this process of defining electrical equipment that, if you stick with me, we're going to get to here in a couple slides. It's not all that revolutionary. I think everybody here is going to be quite familiar with that. Or most people in this room are probably doing some, or if not all, these methods. I just can't move beyond the slide when it says, was it life safety? Am I on that slide? Yeah. I just want to talk about this real quick. The guideline we're looking for riders to address additional content. And if I had my way, the guideline would be equal parts electrical and mechanical and whatever else there is. But we're working up towards that, certainly are. And one of the future topics to be written on is fire alarm and life safety. So when you see the scope item, life safety, be careful. We go back to standards, how it was, let's just say a year ago, even 2 years ago. I would say there was a hole in defining electrical commissioning. If you were an owner and you knew you wanted to commission your electrical system, maybe even today, I don't want to stop this and Google it, but if you Googled electrical commissioning, you likely would not be taken to ACG. You would probably be taken to a third-party electrical testing standard like NETA, because they have a standard called electrical commissioning, and that is not a ASHRAE-approved process, nor is it anything that we would associate with what we do here with ACG. Similarly to life safety, if an owner says, I want to commission my life safety system, and they Google that, they're going to likely be taking NFPA 3 and 4. So when you're responding to this type of request for commissioning service, something to be mindful of. It's defining exactly what that owner wants. Because if you say, yeah, I'll commission your life safety system for 100 hours, let's say 100 hours, you could be in trouble because NFPA 3 and 4 clearly defines what commissioning of life safety is. It's not what we consider the commissioning process, but to an owner, that may be what they have in mind, right? So you are now on the hook to commission active and passive systems, not just fire alarm. We're talking penetrations above ceiling, and you just figured out that the owner wants you to do that. The ceiling tiles are in place. You see if the electrician will let you have a ladder and go poke your head above ceiling. It's not fun. Let me say it this way. If you're not getting paid for it, it's not fun. There's a bunch of other things to do associated with life safety that if you're qualified, it's a very good service, very value-add service to the owner. And all I'm trying to say is be aware of it. It's this type of scope item, very similar to electrical distribution.
Do you mind if I ask a question, Dustin?
Go for it.
So on fire alarm, life safety, that 100% sampling rate that's listed there, if you got an RFP to ask for that, how would you handle that? To me, that means I'm going to test every single fire alarm device in the facility.
Yeah.
How would you go? Would you push back, or would you give them a quote?
Give them a quote. And here's the rub. Whatever set of drawings you get that says here's the design, you're going to show up in the field, and there's that what the wild card is the AHJ and the fire marshal, right? They're going to show up and say, I want you to put 12 more devices down here. And that may be after you've commissioned. And that's just the nature of it, right? The best value add is to commission before the fire marshal. You don't want to associate your efforts with the fire marshal because they're quite honestly not looking at the depth and detail that a commissioning provider does. They're looking at their A, and a commissioning provider is looking at A, B, and C. They're looking at some of that integrated system testing that you talked about earlier, Mark. But the pushback, what kind of makes me a little, we'll provide the service, we'll do it. What's a little scary is nobody knows what the fire marshal, the HJ, is going to come in there and expect, like change things. So when you go to the owner and say, I've looked at 100% of your devices, which in and itself is a challenge. You're walking around with drawings or your tablet, and you got to check every little SD circle walking around. And you're looking at duct attack. You're looking at everything, every single thing. But this is a good example of clearly defining scope, right? We're talking fire alarm, active systems, extend down to the, say there's fire protection, damper flow switches, looking at all those, your timing out your flow switches, seeing that your appropriate dampers close. It's a service, clients want it, and it's considerably more effort than sampling, 20%. It's a lot easy to say I'm going to sample something and just define your sampling rate. To me, it's like, I'm going to walk around and look at every fourth or fifth device, right? 100% is I need to catch everything, and you need to be prepared to do that.
Does that, in your opinion, include the integrated systems testing when doing fire alarm, HVAC shutdown, elevator recall, fire door closure, whatever it might be?
For y'all don't know, Jim's my current boss. Rusty used to be my my other boss. So I've got both bosses in the room, and this has been a discussion internally we've had at SSR. I would argue yes, but I would argue yes because I err on the side of doing more, but that isn't necessarily what's right for SSR if we're not being compensated for that effort or your company. Also, not fair to the client if that's not what they want, right? And they have a limited budget, and they're like, we don't want that. If it's an existing facility, they don't want to hear about that sometimes. We talk about existing facilities if we have time. That's a whole nother can of worms. But if I read this scope item and it says, we want you to commission fire alarm, sampling or not, I'm going to say we, since I respond to most of the estimates, we would include effort for not only initiating a notification devices per NFPA, again, referencing a standard, But the integration of those systems with other, I don't want to say ancillary systems, but it's certainly integration with other systems. And that may be a single point contact, right? If a client says, I want you to commission the fire alarm system, and there's, let's say, a VESDA, a very expensive smoke detector device. That's not what it means, but that's kind of what, it's just, if you've never seen a VESDA system, it's like, I don't know, it's like this big. And it's essentially one smoke detector, and it costs as much as an entire fire alarm system, but they just run PVC pipes and put holes in it, and it draws air in and samples the air, and it just like samples it really well, kind of. So my point is, there's a bunch of systems that are integrated, you know, like let's just say kitchen ANSEL system, maybe more people can relate to that. If we're asked to commission the fire alarm system, I'm not going to flow fire deterrent in the kitchen ANSEL system. I'm gonna go to the kitchen fire alarm person and coordinate with the kitchen ANSEL person or the GC and say, I would like to demonstrate that this system is integrated with the fire alarm, and it's usually a single point. Take the little relay switch or like little mechanical latch and simulate the system being activated. So from the perspective of the fire alarm system, I've seen this ancillary system integrated without actually commissioning the kitchen ANSEL system or like a VESDA system, that such, in that manner. But to answer your question, you know, I would commission an elevator recall. That's a system that's part of fire alarm, very integral to it. Some people may disagree with that. I would consider fire protection something to integrate, test with. Look like you want to say something.
We're spending a lot of time talking about this. Where does commissioning fit between the fire alarm technician that's going to sign the tag on the panel to the state license for it and the fire marshal? I mean, do you really want to get in the middle of that? I mean, are you going to commission it before the fire marshal shows up, or are you planning on doing it with the fire marshal? I think this is a real dangerous topic for commissioning.
And how do you do that? How do you do that?
I would recommend that you don't, because you've got a state licensed fire alarm technician that has to sign the tag. And as a commissioning agent, you're probably not state licensed for that. That's between the fire marshal and the fire alarm company.
So if I implied that the commissioning provider should be signing off or authorizing or certifying anything, I apologize. The commissioning provider is not intended to, particularly life safety systems, be involved with the certification process. That is the AHJ and the fire marshal, or sometimes the electrical like the yeah, it's well, I can understand why you say that. Just want to clarify, not proposing anybody act as an AHJ and sign off on anything. If you feel comfortable doing that, that's your prerogative. I don't think that's an issue. How many people, show of hands, have ever signed off on a fire alarm system for a fire marshal? Yeah, so I don't think that's. Yeah, so I don't think that's really. Yeah, so you can commission a system without signing off on it, and I would argue you commission it prior. Okay, show of hands, how many people have commissioned a fire alarm system? Maybe half the room, maybe a third of the room. I think you can successfully complete, and ultimately it's the client asking you to do that. If in your contract, the client, you said, I'm going to commission your system and I'm also going to sign off on it like I'm the HJ, you're probably in trouble if you don't have those certifications, right? And I don't know how you maintain them doing commissioning work. But as about half the room just raised their hand that are actually doing this work, myself included, you can commission a system successfully. Advance of the fire marshal, I would argue, is more value because you want to commission any system that's complete, right? And you don't want to get in the way of the AHJ. But you know, if we're being honest, sometimes AHJ gets coordinated with commissioning, and that's not the best case scenario. But I don't know if I addressed your concern. I think you just wanted to make a point. Is that right? it's an opportunity for you to participate in the ACG guideline writing. That is a topic coming up. So I'll be around here afterwards. We could talk about it a little bit more. Let me move forward. So, some of these slides I did a little bit out of order, just going off, talking. So who is defining electrical scope? You think you have an understanding of like what's going on, and then you show up, and that's not necessarily the case. And I go back to that example of I was doing a black site test, coordinated it with the world, and a client showed up who, facility operator who I've never seen before, asked me to start testing emergency receptacles. Certainly I can do that, and certainly I would if we were asked to do that during the contractual phase where we were saying how much effort. But it just came, posthumously, while we were doing it at the 11th hour, and it was this discussion of, do I want to make this guy upset? He had tattoos on his knuckles, by the way. And do I want to burn the bridge with this, this client? And it was a conversation that resulted in, I hear you, the time to ask for this was, when we were signing our contract, and I can put you in contact with that person so you can be involved in the future. And it turns out that person was, his boss. So it was like he was just trying to squeeze some juice out of extra juice out of the orange. But if you have a well-written contract with notes and stipulations, you can go to that and head off any of these conversations. In this instance, I didn't have that. I didn't have where I said, I'm not looking at your emergency receptacles. I also didn't have in the contract where it said I should, but omission isn't necessarily, a way out. So, signing a contract, it's going to be you and let's say the client. Sometimes, like I said earlier, the client isn't the owner, and it certainly isn't the HJ at the table. But these are other parties that are involved with the commissioning process that sometimes drive or dictate scope. Here we're going to look at a riser just briefly, just kind of talk through about what we just discussed, and just, kind of talking the flow of electrical distribution equipment before we get into this, talking about equipment rating and source limitation for defining scope. We still got plenty of time for delving into more questions. But maybe if I looked at this, it'd be better. You have your utility transformer. If anybody's commissioning electrical systems, I would clearly stipulate that you're not, unless you feel comfortable, I would try to exclude utility operated equipment. It's a pain in the butt. If anybody's had to work with utility, that secondary side of that utility transformer that's serving the building, that's still utility. You got to get them to come out to open it up. I would argue power distribution begins at the entrance of the building. Even if that's medium voltage, if you're comfortable, qualified, that's where service entrance would begin, at that disconnect, the entrance of the building. And it may be a unit substation stepping it down. It may be medium voltage stepping it down from there. But you have some switch gear. Depending on what engineer design house you're working for, they may call it switchboards. We'll talk about that in a second. But then it steps down to some smaller, maybe a transformer stepping it down to a panel board, or it just steps down to a distribution panel board, then a step-down transformer, then a panel board. Here I want to make the distinction in this example. Can you see that cursor moving? No? Okay, that's unfortunate. Okay. Let's do descriptions. It's story time. Top part of the slide, you see three boxes. The box on the left says DP. There's a little box that's a step-down transformer, and the box on the right is a branch panel board. Or that's how you could define it. That's how this is how this design house is defining it. If you look down to the bottom or most left of the screen, you'll see a box with really tall hair, a lot of conductors coming out of it, so to speak, a lot of circuits. this engineer of records calling this a DP, so defining it as a distribution panel, where the previous aforementioned box could be described as a distribution panel. So there are two applications of what a distribution panel could resemble, and it's all project-based. What I call a distribution panel on one project may not be the same on another, and it's not because what Jesse Felter wants, it's because what I think the owner wants, right? It's ultimately, again, what the owner wants. If the owner...
Top tier is a DP.
Say that again?
You're saying it's a DP, and one of the top two boxes. That's my contact from that stuff.
Well, no, it doesn't say DP, right? It could be described as one because...
Okay, I thought you were saying this guy had a DP. Okay.
Yeah, I might have said that, I apologize. Everybody over there, I'm sorry.
I look at it as a branch.
If that's how the owner defines it, that's not wrong. So, as long as you're on the same page with the owner. Did I see a hand over here when I walked? Okay, we're going to keep moving then. I got a little sidetracked on some other rabbit holes. So again, these slides are going to be provided. And I may go back to that one line here in a second. It's pretty generic, but a good example. Some standards that could be used in defining scope. If you're responding to an RFP or a request for a quote or whatever it may be, and you're negotiating a contract or a scope of services, it may not be necessary to say, we saw one RFP that said, I want you to commission switchboards and panel boards. It may not be necessary to reference NEC and provide a definition with your response. Actually may be tone deaf and not well received by the client. But the intent of this is to provide some resource in bolstering your argument for what is and isn't, and then you using that to get on the same page with the owner, right? So there are resources that are established, industry standards that can be used to help define what electrical distribution equipment is. Talking a little bit about just a specific example. I know I have 15 minutes. I saw you check your phone. Okay. Let's say switchgear. Just use that as an example. It's crazy to me how many people are double E's or have done design background. So it's same company. Or have you worked for different companies by chance? Design as a designer. I'm sorry, I'm that gentleman. Yeah. So saying it's the Wild West isn't quite accurate, but if you work at one design house or one design firm, there's silos, right? Your drafters have pallets, and when they have a distribution need, they'll drop over a box. And that box may be called a switchboard at one designer, may be called a switchgear at another. And when the client is asking you to commission their electrical distribution equipment, they say, I want you to commission my switchgear. And you see that everything you would call switchgear is called switchboards. That may be a time to clarify, well, I know you're asking for switchgear, and here I see the one line that says switchgear, but you have all these you have this distribution lineup that has dry-out breakers and requires rear access. Do you mean this too? So that is a good opportunity to either clarify your scope and define what is in and out of scope, and maybe get that work that would have not been otherwise included in your scope, or cover your butt later when the owner says, no, I just said switchgear, and you stick to switchgear. And then down the road, facility operations, why aren't you commissioning these 4,000 amp trial breakers? That's a good question. Why are we? So, just for those not familiar, if I had to describe, I've had to do this to some mechanical folks. Switchgear and switchboard, just a general appearance. One's as wide as a fridge, and you can't hug it, and requires rear access because that's where your conductors are terminated, and NEC has certain criteria for how switchgear is built, and would have dry-out breakers and some other features. Switchboards, you can mount them up against the wall. and you don't have to necessarily have rear access. And they don't have nearly as stringent enclosure requirements as switchgear, and they're about this wide. So I guarantee anybody in this room that has seen a switchgear and then goes and looks at a switchboard would never confuse the two again. But those are not the owners. Those are not the clients. And that's kind of the discussions we need to have what we need to have in mind when we're talking about our contract, and ACG guideline it is aware of that and is expanding to include some of that, those means and methods to help address that. You know, these slides are just for helping provide references. If you read them, they're kind of vague. You know, they're not too helpful, but they are there. You know, I'm not saying copy paste this into your response to a project, and when you lose it, go, well, what the heck happened? And give me a call. I'm just saying it's defined, and you don't need to reinvent the wheel. You can go to NFPA. You can go to other standards and guidelines and provide some reference or context to why you're defining scope the way you are if asked. You know, here's the too long didn't read. We're going to go in these a little bit detail, but I went into some detail talking about emergency and normal earlier on intentionally. So if your client is asking you to commission your electrical distribution equipment, one way to distinguish that equipment from in and out of scope is, you know, the source. Is it normal or emergency? You know, if they just say distribution equipment, I interpret that to be everything. I'm not going to make the distinction. I'm not going to exclude one or the other. I'm going to say, Mr. and Mrs. Owner, I interpret you to want us to do service entrance down to panel boards. You know, I may or may not include transformers. That's like client, per the, client specific. What kind of an art getting a feel for it. But you can certainly say I interpret that to be normal and emergency power distribution equipment. So source is a good way to distinguish equipment. Got 10 minutes. And just as a question, if you have normal power distribution equipment, you're commissioning, let's say, a patient tower, would you include isolation panels in your fee? Just show of hands. Who would, if the client said just commission normal power, would you include isolation panels? I mean, I'm going to imagine everybody raise their just normal power. I would say yes. I would say you would want to commission isolation panels. It's not a panel that's dedicated to emergency power. It's just like a fancy panel with a little transformer in it for grounding purposes. But that is, again, something that is beyond the depth of most clients, beyond the purview of most contracts, if left alone. So it's a good opportunity to provide a value add. Mr. and Mrs. Klein, I see you just want us to commission normal power stuff. By the way, I interpret that to include isolation panels, which are very important, I would argue. Device rating. We have this really old business development person in our company. I don't know where he came up with this. Maybe Rusty or Jim can tell me. 400 amps and greater. You know, it's a way to define equipment. If your client has so much budget and you need to make that budget spread and give the client the most value add, it's probably not looking at branch panels. It's probably focusing on larger equipment. Equipment that if there was a fault in, it would affect more things downstream. You know, you trip a 20 amp single pole breaker, that may suck for whatever that thing serves. You trip a 800 amp breaker, a 2000 amp serving, say, a chiller, an HU, you know, somebody's getting calls. And then somewhere in that line, you may be getting a call. So we're talking value add here. It's understanding the contract, what the client wants. And again, I've said this before, it's none of these processes, nothing in the guideline that's forthcoming is going to be one of them is going to be your silver bullet. It's several possibilities. I mean, they're all going to be based on what the client, project specific. And it hasn't been addressed before, and I'm looking forward to it being addressed in the future. But here, I don't know where the 400 amp came from. Do you know, Jim?
I don't remember.
Do you?
I think the fact that generally think that a 4.5 bus was a significant distribution panel.
Okay.
You know, but there were some distribution panels that were smaller.
Yeah.
So we're trying to get the sweet spot you just described. Something that's important, that if you lost a breaker in that panel, you lose it more than just a 20 amp circuit.
I recall going down a rabbit hole one day, and I don't know what defines it. It's just 400 amps seems to work out okay for most clients. You know, if they don't want if they're like, hey, you cost too much, we want it to be less. I'm like, okay, well, how about 400 amps and greater? This seems to be a solution. I don't know if it's for everybody.
I think that came from 70B from several cycles back. There was some language about that years ago in 70B.
Okay, that's good to know.
Testing the voltage breakers.
I thought, not that you're wrong. I thought it was from like a manufacturer defined their distribution panels of 400 amps. Now I forget what manufacturer it was, but whatever the case, defining a rating is a good way to define what electrical distribution means to the client. Accepted naming convention. Yep.
How do you test that? How do you commission?
A panel board. Say that again. How do you commission what? Electrical distribution systems. Can I get through my slides? I've got 5 minutes, and I would like to take your question up first. So how do you commission electrical distribution systems? And the third means or method for that's going to be in the guideline for defining electrical distribution equipment is accepted naming convention. And we touched on this a little bit. You know, if the engineer of record is calling everything a distribution panel board, and that's what the client wants you to commission, you can say, you know, I've counted up all the distribution panels, and this is how much effort there is. Oh, by the way, there's 100 branch panels. We can provide a service for that. And what you're doing is defining what you are and aren't. So later, when they come, if a client comes back and says, well, I wanted you to commission these, you can say, look, well, gladly, I'd love to do it for you, love to. But here's where we said we weren't doing it. Here's where you signed. You said, cool, you don't do that, and we'll provide you a fee for it. You know, in other words, using different words. But all that to say, it's kind of like the Wild West. You know, you don't necessarily know. You go into a project, think you know what switchgear is, and all of a sudden, engineer of record comes in and is like, nope, that's a panel board to me. So you have to, using the switchgear, switchboard example that we talked about earlier, understand that trying not to reinvent the wheel helps, and using what the engineer of record is provided to the client may be of use. So where are we today? A lot of this content was provided to the committee. I've since stepped away as an active writer. So all I can say is really where I left off, and that was, you know, this was being considered for development. I have no reason to believe that all or most of this content will be in you know, the next iteration. Maybe Mark can say yes or no. Don't know. Mark would be the one to tell you. But it is not a concern, but it is an area for us to be mindful of. I'm sure everybody in this room has a story of getting burnt with a contract or an owner keeping a client happy, and that's really what we're trying to. What the purpose of this is to let you know what the Guideline Committee is talking about, issues that we've seen in the past, and trying to address that and providing some method for doing so. And also, there's an opportunity to add your voice. If you have other methods, you know, it's not all inclusive. I got a couple minutes. Your question: how do you commission electrical distribution equipment? Mostly, electrical distribution equipment begins with check sheets. And I was talking about panel boards in that particular instance, so I think maybe that's what you're referring to. Usually ends at check sheets. Functional testing usually is relegated to something that is operable, be it mechanical or electrical. When I'm looking at switchgear, if I can draw out a breaker, that's a functional test for me. That asset, that breaker, you know, we're talking like think CxEnergy calls them assets. That would be a separate test, right? If there's a sequence of operation or some type of automatic throwover scheme, a ATO, that's a functional test for electrical distribution equipment. It really depends on what you're talking. When you say electrical distribution, that could be islanding mode for like grid harmonization. You know, it could be a simple functional test for a breaker. It could be reviewing third-party electrical tests. You know, you're not the one doing let's say third-party electrical testing on a breaker, but maybe you're reviewing those test results. Maybe you're not. Maybe you're simply documenting that they were completed. I wouldn't consider that a functional test per se, but that could be like a pre-functional test and just stop at that. So it really means like witnessing a load bank on a generator. That is a functional test for part of an electrical power distribution system. I see you.
Check every outlet.
If you're paid to, yes.
Commissioning electrical systems is.
George, I promised you I would point and hand out the mic, so I've just realized I've neglected that, so I'm sorry. We hopefully have a couple minutes. The question is kind of, where do you stop? You know, and that's really what I'm hoping to convey here. You stop where your contract says. You stop where you're not getting paid to, and that needs to be clear to your clients. It's not where you think; it's where you and the client think, or you're going to get into trouble. I'm sorry, hand in the back. I will say your question out loud if I don't hear it, or if it's not heard clearly.
I'm just curious, when you commission grounding and bonding, is that a separate system, or is that part of your electrical distribution?
The question was about commissioning, grounding, and bonding. Is that part of? Is that a separate system to be considered for commissioning, or part of electrical power distribution commissioning services? Good question. I would approach that on a per project basis. I imagine everybody does it different. Part of our built-in check sheets for our equipment includes verifying grounding at that equipment. So if I'm commissioning a piece of equipment, I am that piece of equipment. I'm looking out at the world, and I'm verifying my grounding's right. And then I'm going to go to the next piece of equipment. I'm going to do that everywhere. Am I showing up on site and verifying that, let's say, the below-grade grounding, the grounding ring, the UFA rings being installed during site work way before the building goes up? I will if that's what the client wants. If I see a scope item that clearly calls out grounding, yeah, I'm going to put effort in that, and I'm going to say what that effort is, and it's up to the client to say, no, that's not what I want. I just want you to see that the green is connected to that little copper bar at the bottom. I don't care about anything else. But if you're like, oh, grounding, oh, I'd love to come out and check out your welds. I would yeah, I'm going to be on site for a week. I'm checking your welds, and you provide a fee for that, and that all of a sudden everybody else didn't do that, and you found yourself out of work because your price was high and you just misinterpreted what the client want. That's really a conversation. That's what I'm trying to get at. It's like, clearly state what you expect. Why is your price that? Maybe the client was like, holy crap, that sounds really important. All these other fools aren't considering it. This one person is. I'm going to go with them. Or maybe you don't win the work because you're so high and they don't care about that. So I say it's a net positive. It's a net positive for our industry as us as providers to be on the same page. That's my spiel. I'm a minute over, and I'd love to talk about life safety. Anybody, any questions, anything else?